I'm Xavier Briggs. I'm a visiting professor at NYU. When it comes to my career, I've spent time in and out of government, academia, and the nonprofit sector mainly. I think it all began at home with a certain set of values. I was raised to believe we are responsible for using our talents to contribute something to the wider world, to the community. And for me, as I grew up and began my career, the questions were not about whether, but about how, and in particular, how to take some technical skills and make them useful in a world in which public problem solving is often political and it's very contested and it's challenging. And that led me to get a PhD eventually, spend some time teaching and doing research and writing. But it also led me into government service a few times where I learned so much about how important it is to understand the history of an issue, different ways it's been named and framed, who has a stake or feel they have a stake in the issue, what their interests are, and basically how to think about complex systems and making change, making progress possible, sometimes in the context of a lot of obstacles and a lot of entrenched opposition or a lack of a sense of urgency. What I do now, for the most part, is advise change makers in a variety of ways. I sit on boards, I advise policymakers and the people who staff them, and I also teach and I write. And I mostly teach and write about economic inequality and opportunity, but also democracy and how social change happens or how it might happen. Going on leave from the university, taking a public service leave as a faculty member for the first time years ago, was not an easy decision or an easy adjustment to make, but I had training. I got a master's degree in public policy and management, and it's not always the reason you go and get a degree, but that contributed to some professional identity too, that was about making government an instrument that helps people, that actually contributes to public problem solving. So in one sense, that felt quite natural. I didn't wrestle so deeply with, do I want to leave research and teaching behind for a while? They are very different environments, there's no question. There was a lot of adjusting to do. But I saw it as an enormous opportunity, and I was encouraged by some faculty colleagues who had served in government or were serving in government, who sort of said to me, we think you could contribute a lot. We think you'd learn a ton. You'll always bring back more, bring back a richer perspective to the classroom and to the university setting. And that seemed right for me. That seemed right to me. That made a lot of sense. I also was very, very motivated by those colleagues who essentially said to me, these opportunities don't come around all that often, so don't count on this as being a window that will just open up any given year. The politics have to be right. It depends on who's in office, whether you get an invitation to sort of jump in and play a particular role. And I found that really compelling, that these are opportunities worth seizing. And that was absolutely right. I have no regrets about leaving university life, going into government, coming back to teaching and writing, serving in a later stint in government, eventually in the White House. It was absolutely career shaping and really fulfilling personally too. I'd love to share a couple of stories about actually getting things done in these settings. Years ago in the late 90s, I worked for President Clinton in the housing and urban development area and got to be a part of an effort to write new legislation, launch a brand new federal program, and also saw that effort ultimately fail. It didn't get enacted, it didn't get approved by both houses of Congress, so it stopped right there. The whole experience of engaging, of thinking about what we were trying to do, thinking through all the different policy puzzles, consulting leading experts and interest groups around the country, and eventually seeing the House of Representatives vote to approve the bill, but the Senate stop it in its tracks, so to speak. was a really rich learning experience. Years later, I drew on that in 1,000 different ways when President Obama was elected, and I went in to serve in the White House. And one of the things I cared deeply about was accelerating the recovery of the Gulf Coast here in the US in the wake of Katrina and other major storms. They're what we sometimes call catastrophic storms. They're the very high intensity hurricanes or earthquakes or other major disaster events. And progress on recovery and the federal role in that was very slow and very fraught and very incomplete. And yet I found when President Obama took office, there were folks who were motivated to be helpful, but no one was sort of on point. And that's one of the things you learn in government as an arena for problem solving, I think, and for having an impact. You have to take ownership of things. Sometimes there's just so much competing for attention. It's important to be entrepreneurial, especially in those big institutions. And that was certainly the case when it came to accelerating the recovery down in New Orleans in particular, and all throughout the Gulf Coast across several states. And I happened to be in a role helping to run the Office of Management and Budget, as it's known. It's kind of a nerve center for the federal government. And my portfolio included a bunch of agencies, including Homeland Security, which includes the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and also HUD, Housing and Urban Development, which has another role in disaster recovery, and a host of other agencies as well. And the experience was one of winning attention for the issue, engaging a really superb staff of mostly civil servants in analyzing where the bottlenecks were. In other words, where the federal role was stuck in some sense, and how the election itself, the new leadership had not unstuck it. We would need to be very, very deliberate. There were all kinds of difficult things, like people living in trailers that had formaldehyde that were not intended for long-term habitation. They were intended for short-term use, but they had become de facto homes, and many, many other challenges to making resources flow and improving people's lives. And ultimately, the experience was so satisfying because of the unique role I was in, because of the need to work in a politically savvy way across a host of different offices in the White House, each of whom had a sort of different stake in the issue. And ultimately, we were able to unstick billions of dollars, able to create much more federal, state, and local cooperation, and make enough progress that President Obama, roughly a year on from that, just a little more than a year on from taking office, at the 10th anniversary of Katrina, the hurricane making landfall, and this was, the 5th anniversary, this was 2010, the summer of 2010, could go to New Orleans, make a set of major announcements that simply would not have been possible unless we sort of unwound this big knot, of government regulation, of budgetary roadblocks, of standoff between state and local and federal actors who sort of couldn't agree on what to do with major projects stuck and so on. And working that through was extremely satisfying, and it depended on having formal authority, but also, I think, showing humility, showing curiosity, listening to other people's take on the problem, whether it was the mayor of New Orleans and his chief of staff, whether it was civil society players, engineers, university professors, people in philanthropy, stakeholders on Capitol Hill, in the Congress who cared about these things, including members of the delegation from the Gulf states, of course. So a lot of complexity, but really meaningful to, help to orchestrate progress in that context and get the best schools built that have been built, for children in Louisiana, probably in 70 or 80 years, housing rebuilt, the economy restarted and pushed in a more climate sustainable direction, and racial equity embedded as a core principle in a much deeper way, employment promoted, a whole host of things. And when it comes to making a difference in this context that I've described, the White House, Congress, the different levels of government, the private and nonprofit sectors, the things that are difficult about recovery from really catastrophic events, a few things come to mind for me when it comes to key skills, things that I think learners and change makers need to understand. So one is it really, really pays to know your history and learn your history and learn it with humility. What's the series of events that precede you? What's the history of naming and framing the issues you want to work on? There's history to everything. So how have the issues been thought about? Who's thought about them in different ways? People are very responsive when you ask these questions. They're appreciative that you want to know. So you're also building trust as you go along, and appreciation as you go along, that you're not a kind of arrogant problem solver who thinks they have all the answers, the expert who's sort of going to rush into the rescue. So learning the history is really important. Second thing is, I took a negotiation course many, many years ago when I was in school, and later taught negotiation as a faculty member. And that has served me in all of the problem solving work I've done. The ability, the skill set to analyze interests in a given issue, the players, what their interests are, the more tangible interests, the more intangible interests, the options that have been considered or not considered, and why. I think we tend to misread or misthink that negotiation is just horse trading. More for you is less for me. We think about it in very zero-sum terms. There's a lot of research to indicate that most human beings kind of have that view of negotiation, and they fear being taken advantage of. It's much more constructive if you care about public problem solving, especially to think of negotiation as a creative process of shared decision making. Some of the people who are critical, and the players who are critical to getting a powerful result, they don't work for you, they are not subject to your authority, they need to make up their own minds. They need to see what you're helping to create together as more appealing than some other option. So being able to analyze the parties and the interests, let's call it negotiation for short, it's really, really a valuable skill set. And then there's analytic skill on the technical issues themselves. I'll give you a quick example. One of the issues that was very stuck in the recovery from Hurricane Katrina was the rebuilding of public schools, a particularly important kind of public facility. Well, the federal government and the local government and the state couldn't agree on how to share costs and what standards to build to. And as basic as that sounds, that had everything stuck, and for several years, which is a huge problem when you think of the number of kids that need to go back to school in good facilities with effective teachers, et cetera, and how important that is to community life more broadly. And there were a set of analytic skills to bring to bear on that problem, as well as the housing problems and the labor market problems. So it is really important to learn analytic skills, to nurture curiosity and a flexibility of mind, by which I mean a willingness to look at a problem 3 or 4 or 5 different ways. I've always been grateful for how my early training, initially as an engineer, by the way, sort of prepared me to be open to looking at a problem from different angles, and then sort of jump in with analytic skills and help other people use their analytic skills in the most effective way. If I think about other stories of making change, things that are meaningful to me, one that stands out is from my time working in philanthropy. So I was vice president of a major social justice philanthropy, one that cares about making progress on hard problems, often problems that are about inequality, human rights, fundamental fairness, who has a voice. And I was in that role when the 2016 presidential election happened. And after the election of Donald Trump, we realized that we needed to rethink our strategies, ask ourselves what assumptions no longer held. Did we need to work with our partners in new ways? And one of the things that became apparent in that moment, this is, let's say, in the first 6 months of 2017, was that the social sector, most of our grantee partners were nonprofit or civil society organizations, not only in the US, but around the world. Many of them were not accustomed to dealing with the level of volatility and unpredictability in the environment that we saw. And we began a conversation, the foundation, with these civil society leaders about what it would look like to exercise more foresight, to get in the habit of contingency planning, for example. And that led to a major initiative I found very satisfying, very meaningful, and very pleased at the long-run impacts several years on from those early conversations, to use, for example, scenario building techniques and exercises, which are almost non-existent in the social sector, in the change-making field, broadly defined, and to sort of bring them in. They're well developed in the corporate world, especially the big commodity companies, the companies that sort of plan on 5 and 10 and 15 and 20-year time horizons. They've been using those skills for half a century now, the natural resource industries, for example. They're also well known in the national security and intelligence community. They're part of the sort of bread and butter craft of preparing for a volatile world and many different things that could happen. But social movement leaders, advocates and nonprofits who support them didn't have this skill set. And I was a part of seeding an effort and connecting them to leading practitioners who could sort of bring in the technical expertise. And about 5 of the leading civil society advocates in America decided on a cooperative basis they wanted to create a joint project, have their CEOs involved, so the very highest level leaders were personally involved, and that sent a signal throughout their organizations. And they were supported by these technicians, in a sense, these professional scenario builders, to look at alternative futures, things that might be about situations related to public safety and security, the escalation of rhetoric around threats and the use of police powers, like things we've been debating this year, 2020, very intensively. A new economic downturn, which almost no one was thinking about it at the time. The economy was growing at a pretty rapid clip. The census 2020, what happens if it doesn't function properly? What happens if it doesn't if it's not treated as a trustworthy source? So looking at hard futures, things that are not pleasant to think about, but sort of forcing yourself to think about them. And how would your organization, or how would your coalition of organizations respond to that? It's a very special initiative, not a very public one. It continues to function. It's drawn in more resources now from other funders. And it has, as we hoped then several years ago, spurred a lot of interest more broadly in the social sector and the change-making field in emulating that kind of work and that kind of thinking and recognizing the value of it. So I see it as having those broader ripple effects, and that's very, very meaningful. And if I think about the skills that mattered and what you need to learn to make a difference in that context, first, I think there's a real importance in understanding fields and how they evolve. Sometimes they're synonymous with professions, but the ability to sort of think of a field as a field and ask, where did it come from? What were its animating ideas? Whatever it might happen to be. Civil engineering, city planning, public health, the field of public interest media or civic media. Could be almost any field. Where did it start? What was the genesis? What were some of the animating ideas? What's the field been good at or not so good at? What are some of the regular practices? And does it have major blind spots? And if so, how might one think about addressing those? This may sound like an unusual set of skills, but the ability to step back, think of a field as a field, not simply a set of technical problems to be solved, I think is very important. And a lot of leadership and innovation in making change comes from asking those kinds of questions. Beyond that, it was very important substantively to have emotional intelligence, to listen and ask open-ended questions, and gauge whether leaders for change were genuinely interested in working together in this new way, to practice this new kind of thinking, to build scenarios together, and not to sort of force it on them, to take for granted that they would see the value in it. It was very important that the motivation be very internalized, that it come from them. So I think that ability, as we sometimes say, to read people, to sense when they're hesitant, when they're going along maybe to be polite or because they like you personally and they want to listen and they want to be seen as responsive, but they have doubts, giving them room to express those doubts and then working through them and sort of addressing questions together and creating that spirit of problem solving jointly, not simply pitching someone on something you know to be the one best way. That's a set of what are sometimes called soft skills, but they're really important for making change. If I were to give advice to would-be change makers, to those who are motivated, I'd highlight a few things. The first, as simple as it may sound, is the importance of curiosity, of being deeply curious about how change happens. There's a very good book I use in one of my courses. The course is called Sparking Social Change. It's for learners from different backgrounds. They're coming from different fields, different forms of training. And we use this book called How Change Happens, in part because of the emphasis on curiosity and being curious, especially about systems and how they work, and sort of continually asking the question, why, and even getting other people to coach you on that. These days, you can do an enormous amount of desktop research, thanks to the internet in particular. It's easier than it used to be to learn about almost anything, but you often need insiders, people who are close to a problem or already trying to make a difference on that problem, to coach you as well, to let you work alongside them and learn as they learn. But it doesn't work unless you're curious, unless you go in with a fairly open mind about causes and effects and kind of where change can come from. Sometimes we make up our minds too quickly and we sort of work with tunnel vision about the change we're trying to create. So curiosity is the number one thing I always stress. The number two is gaining some skills, some orientation to systems thinking. There's a lot out there, a lot of it very publicly available, for example, about where the leverage is to change systems. The rules in the systems matter, but so do power relations, as systems thinkers call them. In other words, the power, the sort of interests that grow up around a system and how it's functioning, that often protect the current functioning of the system and resist change. And then at the highest level of all, the power of beliefs and mental models, people's paradigms, the working assumptions they make, which they often don't question at all. And because they're so unquestioned, they're not named, and they're very, very powerful. That can be a tremendous source of leverage over change, even though it's tricky to affect. So there's a whole vocabulary out there, which is learnable, about the leverage points and systems for making change, and that's really helpful. And the last thing I'd stress is deeply internalizing the idea of interests. And in a sense, it's small p politics. We tend to think of politics as being all about elections and political parties and that kind of thing. One thing I've seen in my career in direct service, whether in government or the nonprofit sector, but also as an educator for about 25 years now, is the degree to which problem solvers tend to look at politics as something that gets in the way. It's this unfortunate thing that stands in the way of real effective problem solving. It's just not a constructive way to look at politics. I encourage would-be change makers to think of small p politics as being the public realm and the public sphere, and where we bring our interests and our values and we have a kind of public debate. Change making has to be a part of that. It can't just be a technical process that counts on sort of toppling political barriers as though they were dominoes or hurdles that just stand in the way. Public problems are value-laden. People can rightly disagree on how to name them, on how to frame them, and can think about who has an interest in the outcomes in a variety of different ways. So I encourage would-be change makers to embrace that, to learn the skills of negotiation, for example, of understanding interests in a more creative way. I've done some writing and put it out there in a project I created online. It's called the Community Problem Solving Project. It has a bunch of free tools, including some on negotiation. I always recommend the book Getting to Yes, which is a classic for how to think about interests and options and collaborative problem solving, and how that is unavoidably suffused with interests. Interests aren't going to go away. People aren't being bad just because they bring their interests into a problem solving process or a process of change making. I think it's really important to internalize that. And the earlier in your career or your avocation to be a change maker, I teach a couple of courses in this area. One is called Sparking Social Change, and it is about how social change happens on a transformative scale. It's not primarily about sort of creating a project or a new nonprofit organization. A lot of social entrepreneurship is focused there, and that's constructive. But this is more systemic in the way we look at problems. And we use cases for the most part, like raising labor standards in America, or achieving marriage equality, or inventing new fields like public health or public interest law or public interest technology, a much younger field. What's the craft of building new fields? What does a strong field look like? And we try in that course to put equity at the center, to ask a lot about who has a voice or doesn't, how are the rules of the game constructed to create a more equitable conversation, a more equitable sense of what success looks like, and as much as possible to make people most affected by problems, often the most marginalized and excluded, change makers themselves. How do we think about agency and leadership coming from communities most affected? And sometimes we go to extreme environments and contexts to sort of explore that. Latin America, where indigenous communities have been shut out of politics and the economy. Or America, for example, with our long history of racial injustice, racial exclusion, but also gender inequity and other kinds of inequities. We use a range of settings and a range of different contexts and ideas for looking at equity. A second course I teach, also about change making, is focused on economic inequality, understanding the what of it, what are its dimensions, how do we measure it, how do we understand its severity, and how it's been changing and getting worse over time in much of the world, but also what are the drivers of inequality? What are the underlying causes, so that we can think about what will most affect them, the root causes or the drivers, not just affect the symptoms. So we don't just want to mitigate symptoms, we want to affect the things that are producing and reproducing inequality, not just in America, but in other parts of the world, over years and even generations, so we can figure out how not just to be concerned about inequality and have a public conversation about it, the kind we've been having for years now, but how to do something about it and what that's really going to require. And of course, that leads squarely back to how does social change happen on a larger scale? Where does power come into play? What are the interests? But also, what do we know on a more technical level about the kinds of changes, for example, in the economy that would make the biggest difference, whether it's rewriting the tax code, whether it's driving new models for business and how it should function, whether it's raising labor standards, developing new skills for a changing economy and a changing future of work. A wide array of different things can make a difference, but we want to interrogate the evidence about that. And that's in part a technical conversation as well. Some things are going to make a bigger difference than others, and we want to have an intellectually honest conversation about that.